Welcome to NetMod in IETF116. I'm Lou Berger. I have also online with me my co-chair, Kent Watson, and our secretary, Jason, who's been a huge help putting together the material and the agenda for this session. So thank you, Jason. Appreciate that. And with that, Kent, I think you're going to take us away.
You have slide control?
I do, but I think you're presenting, or am I presenting?
So yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, apparently I'm presenting. So we are towards the end of the week, and so you should all be familiar with our note well. Basically, this is our statement related to our process, and that anything you say here becomes a contribution and is governed by our process. Please, if you're not familiar with the note well, check out that URL and become familiar with it. And the key takeaway is when you contribute, there's an expectation that you follow the rules, which includes disclosures of IPR. The IETF also has a code of conduct, which basically comes down to please be professional and respectful. Even if you're in a heated discussion, keep it technical and avoid anything that is could be construed as a personal comment. Again, we're at the end of the week, and we've been doing this doing online for a while now. So I think people are familiar with how to manage the session when you're remote. When you're here in person, the only change that's come along recently is please make sure you register with the on-site tool. It's very important. And that's, you can scan the QR code and jump right in. We all are going to use the Meet Echo for queue control, both in room and out of room. So if you have something you want to say on at the mic, please make sure to click raise your hand on the app and then join the queue, and that's how you'll be recognized. Even if you want to respond to someone else, please join the queue in the app and be recognized there. Final point on this slide is please join also in our joint minute taking. The URL to that is also in the chat. So if you want an easy way to get there, you can click there. There's also other buttons in Meet Echo to take you there. Excuse me. We have a pretty packed agenda. While we started out with extra time, as always happens, we get late minute requests and the agenda gets pretty full. Okay, so we have no recent RFCs or documents in the queue. You know, we're here to produce documents, so it's always better when there's something there. But we're close on the common Yang types. Kent, do you want to say anything on that?
Really? I mean, it's been pushed to Rob for AD processing. Just waiting for that review to come back.
Okay, great. Looks like Rob wants to say something, but maybe not. Oh, I think, okay, so he's processing it. That's great. We have some documents that are post last call. Sorry about the font changes. Not quite sure why we have that. We have on the agenda, we have an update on what's happening on these long-standing documents related to Ethernet. Those are the first two. On agenda also is the versioning documents. We are really hopeful that these will be, we can complete this work and move it forward for lucky before the next IETF, but we will hear from the authors what they think shortly. Syslog, that's with Kent. I can't remember if there's anything specific to say there, Kent.
No, I just need to process it, do the Shepherd write-up, and push the button.
Okay. We have one document that is not on the agenda, and a question to the authors is, how can we get this document complete? What's left? So I'm going to pause here for a moment.
This is Qing, and for note tag, actually we make update since last IETF meeting and posted to the list, waiting the feedback from Yugen and Evan. We got stuck there.
So you think you're done?
Yeah, we think it's done.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we've had one incoming liaison that is from 3GPP, and it talks about a need that they have. They have a requirement that they'd like to see filled, and they talk about is invariant and system created properties. And they've identified a particular draft as a candidate solution. We have Scott coming to the mic.
Yes, thank you, Scott Mansfield Erickson. I just wanted to provide a little warning because the ITUT Study Group 15 meeting is coming up in the last 2 weeks of April, and I suspect that you'll see a liaison from them saying pretty much what 3GPP just said. So there is support for this even beyond 3GPP. Thank you.
Okay, great. So this is something to keep in mind as we discuss the document, that document that's identified later in this session. Oh, Charles?
Yep. Hey, Charles Eckel. And yeah, just wanted to mention a couple things. First of all, for those of you who don't know, I'm the new liaison manager from IETF to 3GPP. So I'm interested in following this, and not an endorsement for, you know, the approach that's been provided. I think it's going to be discussed and it's in the liaison. But I do think it's important that we get a response back to 3GPP saying, hey, we understand your requirements. We think this draft is right on track. It's going to be adopted, or we have real issues with the draft. We think we need, you know, or we already have a different solution. Whatever that is, I think we need to discuss on the list perhaps, but send some response back to them so they know we're taking it seriously.
Great.
Yeah, thanks.
As is the case for most working groups, we always appreciate suggested response text being sent to the list. If for some reason you don't feel comfortable sending it to the list and you want to discuss it with the chairs first, that's acceptable as well. But if you have a suggestion on how to respond, we are interested in hearing from you. Thank you. We're familiar with working remote. This is really just a placeholder to remind the working group that we can do interims if that is helpful in moving the process forward. We don't have to wait for a formal IETF to have a formal meeting. And if you think that you need some added discussion time, higher bandwidth channel than email, you're welcome to put in a request for a formal virtual meeting. Just contact the chairs, the chair's alias. That'll also hit Jason, who no doubt will be helpful in setting that up as well. And with that, we're going to move on to Scott Mansfield. You do not need to join the queue for this. You can own the mic in the room.
Oh, this is perfect. Thank you very much. Welcome to the last day and the last session of NetMod for this week. So this is the first presentation, and it's a presentation that just a recap of what happened at 115 and now what's happened since IETF 115 for these drafts. I inherited these from Rob because they had stalled, and so Don Fedek and I have been trying to progress the work that has been identified. So if you go to the next slide, there are two drafts, and there are GitHub. I think the GitHubs were on the front page, but they've been republished, and I've updated them based on the comments and addressed what I think I addressed, the comments that were listed in the issues on the GitHub. And there's other contributors that have identified that they're interested in this work and getting it done. So we have other eyes on this other than just Don and I. And the one thing I know we need to do is that there's an acknowledgement section. We need to clean that up, and there's some other editorial things that I'm sure will come out in a last call. So if go to the next slide. So where we are is that the Common Interface Extension Yang, all the issues, like I say, have been addressed. And in the sub-interface, there is something that I want to send out. I should put this out on the mailing list and not just do it through the issues list, but it's still referencing this draft called IETF Best L2 VPN Yang. That one's long expired. So I would like to know if we really need to keep referencing that, or if we can just remove that. So that's something that I would like to see some discussion. And looks like we have a
Rob Wilson. Oh yes.
Yeah,
sorry.
process
We have a
violation.
process violation by our AD.
I'll fix my
This is
process
Rob
violation in a
Wilson.
minute. Rob Wilson, Cisco. Just to say, this is with no hats on. It's not a process violation. Is it a nominative reference or informative reference?
It's right now. It's just an informative reference. I think we can just get rid of it.
Okay, fine, thanks.
Would be what my. See, now that's properly following the process.
Yeah, for the sub-interface V9 Yang, I see actually in this draft, just briefly review it, mention like a attachment circuit, L2 VPN attachment circuit. So I just want to remind actually there's attachment circuit draft has been discussed in TIS and also OPSWG, may be relevant. I'm not sure it could replace
We should
this,
check. Yes,
this one
that's
with
right.
attachment circuit, but we can think about that.
I can. That's a good idea. We can have that conversation.
Yeah. Be careful not to get slowed
I know.
down.
I got it. Yeah,
Yeah.
It's useful to consider. It may just be a terminology issue, considering that this one was from like 2018.
Yeah.
So
Rob Wilson, Cisco. Just a quick question back to Chin. Is the attachment circuit one a device level Yang model, or is it a network level Yang model?
right.
The attachment circuit model you referenced,
Yes.
it's device level.
It could be either.
Could
It's
be
either,
either.
yeah.
Ah, fine. Okay, thanks.
But I'm with Lou, and so we do need to address that. That's why I put it in here, and I wanted to see some, hear some issues. So, or hear some comments. So if you go to the next slide.
So just to be clear on that reference, I think if it's informative,
Yeah.
take it out, send a message to the list, ask
Yeah.
if there's any objections.
That's right.
Move forward.
Got it. That's the direction I'm looking for. So just we're hoping, I mean, these are fairly well done, and they've been out there for a while, and the comments that were there have been addressed. So I think we're at the point where sometime between now and 117, we would like to start a last call on these things and have them finished by 117. So that's all I had.
That would be awesome. Thank you
Thanks.
for taking this work back up.
Mhm.
So next up, what? Yeah. Okay. We have Tom Hill and Joe. I'm not sure who's going first. Tom, you're going to do both?
Joe will swap out in a second, I think.
Oh, okay.
So
He
he'll
is
come out and
here.
do the second part.
You were hiding there. Thank you.
That's grand. That'll stay there, I hope. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Friday at last. So a little update on the Yang versioning solutions. We have obviously been meeting weekly for quite some time now, including over a couple of the last IETF meetings. And I just want to give you a quick update on where we are with this. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So just to recap, the Yang versioning solution overview includes 5 different drafts: Yang module revision handling, semantic version number scheme, or a module semantic version number scheme, schema comparison tooling for these Yang modules, versioned Yang packages, and also some operations for package version selection, such that clients can select between different schema versions within a package. Next slide, please. And there's just all the URLs of the drafts that we've been showing some love to over the last couple of years. Next slide, please. So, very basic general update. We are meeting every week, as I suggest, with the authors and many of the interested parties, including myself. There's quite a few different companies involved in this, many are vendors. There's fewer operators involved. So big plea if you're interested in this work and you happen to work in an operational context or for an operational company, that would be useful. Key issues are of course brought back to the working group mailing list. We do a lot of work back and forth on GitHub as well. The actual weekly meeting is hard to schedule across as many time zones as possible, but we're working on 2 p.m. GMT, well, local UK time, and that turns out to be about 9 a.m. Eastern most of the time. And of course, you can see a little bit more about what we're actually doing in real time on the GitHub page there with the URL. Next slide, please. So the second working group last call is imminent for the module versioning and Yang Samva drafts, which is great to see. There's a few little bits and pieces there to be done, the IPR calls, and we're just making some chops and changes to who is a contributor and who has just been acknowledged. The focus on the weekly meetings at the moment is primarily on the schema comparison draft. We're working heavily on that at the moment. There are plenty of key issues identified that we're working through. So if you're interested in this piece, please jump in as soon as you can. Packages draft is next. It always seems to be next, but packages draft is next, and so I'm looking forward to that myself. Next slide, please. And that is the back, yeah. So I think it's time for Joe for the next bits and pieces.
Thanks for the update and good progress. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
All right, so this is the current work that the authors and contributors are working on. We chose schema comparison to work on next because we felt that based on some of the comments that we were getting around the Yang module versioning, Yang Simver, we wanted to create tooling that would help kind of figure out for both consumers of Yang modules as well as authors of Yang modules how they should go about creating versioning rules or understanding the backwards compatibility between various Yang artifacts, modules, and packages when we pick that work back up. So this is turning out to be quite a bit of work, and as Tom mentioned, we would love more voices, especially operational voices. So next slide, please. All right, so we have a few things that we're going to go through here because as we delved into this, as we started to peel the layers of the onion, we saw that there were a lot of things to consider. So we have obviously the underlying tooling requirements that we want to do, but we also want this ultimately to help those, as I mentioned, the consumers, the authors, understand what are the backwards compatible, non-backwards compatible, maybe some of the trickier non-backwards compatible and editorial changes in the modules, either the modules they're writing or the ones they're consuming as part of their applications. And then help the users decide whether or not they have to make tooling changes of their own to their own reporting, their own automation, management, whatever tools. Next slide, please. The issues we're now facing, we have this notion of an on-wire versus a schema related change. And what does that mean? What are the rules with respect to checking that? We have slides on all of these things, so I'm just going to blow through this on the summary slide. We'll also talk about what does it mean to be compatible in terms of error messages. Something that came up was how dependent are people on the structure of these, the text within these error messages? So we'll talk a little bit about that. And what is the comparison scope? Are we looking at module by module and doing a comparison there? Or are we considering the schema as a whole or the artifact as a whole, like in a package world, and considering changes there? So we'll get into some of these. So I can see everyone's waiting to ask questions, but we'll get there. Next slide, please. So on-wire versus schema analysis and looking at the different changes there. On-wire meaning this is what you would actually see if you did a sniffer trace and you decrypted it. This is what you would see on wire. Did that change? Is something turning from a string to an int, for example? That would be something that you would see reflected on wire versus the schema, which would be something that might not necessarily, and we have an example of this, not necessarily be something that's reflected on wire. If you were looking at a before sniffer trace and an after sniffer trace, it would look the same. But there's still, especially for module authors, there's still a challenge there. So do we go with one or two algorithms with which to determine backwards compatibility? And the consensus amongst the contributors was we would have two different algorithms. The on-wire algorithm would focus more on the client compatibility. Obviously, if that string changed to an int, that's going to break some clients. So we want to make sure that we're focused there. Whereas with schema, we're looking at a lot more, we're being a lot more nitpicky, so to speak, and looking at those schema node differences, because that's likely going to trip up the module authors, especially those that depend upon your module. And then we also have to consider what's going to happen if there is a or let's just say a text change initially. Could be semantic change, could be non-semantic change. We want to highlight both. So we also want to be able to point out those non-semantic changes that are in fact editorial. And we're going to be as adherent to RFC 7950 in terms of the backwards compatibility rules with respect to things we also added in module versioning. So reordering of things would also not be allowed. Next slide, please. So here's our on-wire algorithm. So comparison is made, we flatten everything, we look at all of the Yang paths and the definitions, and we look at the instance identifier. We don't really care about schema nodes at this point, so things like choice names, we're not looking at them. We're instead looking, did anything change within that path? Are nodes going away? Are the types of nodes changing to a point where we would see things reflected as something that changes on the wire? So we're not looking like if a grouping name changes from an on-wire standpoint, that doesn't really matter to us. We just want to make sure that if a client is going to send what it was sending in terms of a configuration change, that's going to be accepted. That would be backwards compatible. If it's not, if things change there such that the on-wire scheme, the on-wire payload would change, then that would be reflected as a non-backwards compatible change. Next slide. Whereas on the schema side, so the schema comparison algorithm is looking at these hierarchies from a schema node standpoint. So here we take into account things like choice names changing. That affects the points that you might interoperate with from a schema standpoint, like if you're going to use a uses, like if you're going to use an augment. You want to make sure that if I'm going to depend upon your module, maybe not as much as important for vendors since we don't typically see customers extending our modules, but from a standards definition standpoint, if our modules could be extended, we want to be able to report on any schema changes. And that includes things like type def name changes. So even though the on-wire didn't change, if we changed the name of a type def that we might depend on in some other module, that will, of course, generate a non-backwards compatible issue for those consumers, and we want to flag that. So therefore, we're looking at the full non-backwards compatible rules that we laid out, inheriting from RFC 7950 and documenting ultimately in the Yang module versioning draft. That's the schema change. Next slide, please. So let's look at an example. So let's say we have this leaf that used to be, was called counter, used to be of a type uint8. That was version 1.0, let's say. In version 2.0, or version next, we change counter to be a type counter underscore T. So it's a type def of type counter. This would be non-backwards compatible from the standpoint of the schema. So we've changed this type. It isn't exactly what we would say from a schema standpoint. That we're ultimately changing the type. However, on wire, it might still be this unsigned integer, unsigned 8-bit integer. So 42, we might still see 42. On the wire, the values could be the same, but we've changed the underlying schema definition of this node. So on a wire standpoint, it would be backwards compatible. In the schema world, it would be non-backwards compatible. Jeff.
I'm willing to wait until later.
Okay. He's willing to wait till later. So slide 8, please. So there's still several open questions in this. Obviously, we're still debating a few of these items, whether or not they are to be considered non-backwards or backwards compatible, and how should we go about reporting all of this, and at what verbosity should we go about reporting all of this. Should we report when the definition is changed, when things are used? What does the ultimate what do users want to see? This is one thing that we would definitely like feedback on, is to how this ultimately on wire versus schema, how all of this should be reported, and what would be the most useful in terms of consuming the output from such a tool or set of tools that would do these schema comparisons. Next slide, please. So some of the open questions, whether or not it's backwards compatible or not, and how to report, related to groupings and uses. In general, we think that changing a grouping statement, that breaks the kind of the requirements, the linkage, if I'm going to depend upon your module. So we'd think that's backwards compatible. Same thing with things like type defs. Changes there, choice names, things that could become potentially used as augment points or inherited or relied upon from one module to a next. We would think those are backwards compatible. Now, where things get a little bit interesting is if we just rename a type def, is that an on-wire? We could say, yes, that is a schema level non-backwards compatible change, since we might use that type def as another module depending on yours. But because if it's the same underlying base type, does it become an on-wire change? And how do we report any of these small editorial changes? Is it something that is by default people want to see, or is it something that they're not necessarily, that might be protected behind an argument? Instead, people are more interested in the higher level, the non-backwards or backwards compatible changes at a larger scope. Next slide, please. More so, editorial changes that we can't really detect, are they editorial or are they semantically different? We would probably want to flag changes to the description statement and say we don't really know. I mean, maybe ChatGPT could help us out there. I don't know. But we don't really know if this change to text is backwards compatible or not. So it could be potentially non-backwards compatible. So we might want to have different arguments there to at what level do we start flagging some of those. There's also text that exists, conditionals that exist in when and must statements. We're not necessarily interested in evaluating all of that. So maybe we would mark this as either a change to the text within there, the conditionals within there. We would either flag that as non-backwards compatible or potentially non-backwards compatible. So those are things to consider. What do people want to see? What is the right balance of tool complexity versus things that provide us that provide the users the most use? Same could apply to presence containers. At what level do we say this is non-backwards compatible versus we can't really tell, so we'll flag it maybe as potentially backwards compatible, non-backwards compatible. Slide 11, please. Oh.
as you're moving, you actually have 3 people in queue. If those people in queue would like to ask before waiting to the end, we can just come to the mic.
Okay.
If that's okay with you.
No, it's fine.
Lou, can you repeat for the microphone?
Doing some blocking. Sorry, my mic was off.
Yeah, can you
I
repeat?
was just saying that we have multiple people in queue that we don't have to wait to the end unless you want to, and it
No.
sounds like
Well.
it's okay. And while Jeff is first, he's going to wait to the end. Or maybe not.
Or maybe not.
Jeff Haas, would you return to slide 7 briefly?
Slide 7, please.
So I'm going to pick on this as a very specific example. So in the case where counter T is being defined, the types of thing you care about here is, has the underlying type def versus the prior type, is type 1, no, that is new, versus type 2 that is old, have similar semantics. So it's possible to have a counter T defined that is strictly a uint8 that hasn't changed anything, that maybe only adds a description and adds units seconds as an example, or units, something else. So this is an example of there's no actual change. It's worth flagging of because it's of interest, but we haven't actually changed the underlying semantics.
Correct. This is kind of a soft example, but some of the things that we've considered, the potential though is this could lead to schema related backwards incompatibility down the road, whereas initially from especially you mentioned units, assuming the units doesn't actually change the context of the node, you wouldn't see a difference on the wire. The client would still successfully make that config change.
You're absolutely correct. So like if it adds a units, it doesn't change the semantic necessarily unless you know that. So it's worth flagging, but it can't be strictly automated to say that this is a violation.
Yeah, and it's a good point. And these are some of the challenges that we discuss is and sometimes the rabbit holes we go down is at what level are we considering? And we want to make this as useful and as less noisy as possible for all involved. So it's those extra insights that we can get that really help hone this work a little bit more.
Yeah, they got to flag another specific item here is that changes of type defs that have regular expressions as their match criteria. That is a thing that you really probably can't get away with trying to do. And I'm going to pick a very specific example that we're living with right now in the BHP Yang module. We have courtesy where we grab stuff, 2 different regular expressions for validating IPv6 addresses. They are semantically equivalent. They are textually different.
And that goes again to maybe to the win and the must that we're going to get into something I think where it's potentially non-backwards compatible as a output of this tool because we either can't or can't easily run down whether or not those are semantically different. Chin.
Yeah, Chin. Actually, for these 2 algorithms, one is one on wire, the other one is a schema. I think one is the instance level, the other one is schema level. So for on wire analysis, maybe just to try to identify syntax consistent issue. But for the schema level, maybe more check the syntax. So one example I'm a little bit confused is if we have some description text change, whether I use on-wire analysis or schema analysis.
So the question is, so you're right, instance level, on-wire, schema level, schema.
Yeah.
And your question is, if we have a description change, is it on-wire or schema change?
Yeah.
That would be, that would be schema level change because what changes on how you approach that might change as a client. You might if you knew that it was different, but it wouldn't necessarily change on wire. We might still have to flag it up because how the client would behave differently if they knew that the semantics of that changed. I can't think of a quick example off the top of my head, but it might still be something that we'd want the client to know that, okay, even if you send the same data, you're going to exhibit a different behavior on the underlying server. Even though it doesn't change what's on wire, it might change the behavior that the client has. So we probably still have to show that in more of an on-wire look. So
Okay.
there is a little bit of gray area there.
Yeah, I also think, we have two these kind of analysis algorithm. Because we already implement this on-wire analysis, we think it more easily to implement, you compare based on per XPath. But, you go to this kind of schema analysis, actually, maybe you need to, this can provide a fine granularity, this kind of comparison analysis, but it's very complicated a little bit. So I'm just wondering whether for these two analyses, we should choose one mandatory to implement, the other one is option.
So we're going to get to a slide, probably the next slide, not after this, but the next where we talk about what is the output of the work. Do we put code, pseudocode, some code? Like I always think of the line wrapping example that went into the draft. Is it that the ultimate thought is, well, the thinking of the working group or the group that the contributors is that some of the output of this would be the code. So would it be mandatory to implement for us as the contributors? I don't think we've gotten to what's mandatory, what we're absolutely, it's still an open question, but it would be something that would ultimately be contributed to the industry, the people at large, versus something that every vendor or every Yang body would implement. It would be something where this, whatever gets codified or written or published in this document would be implemented in code once, and there would be, well, maybe ported to a few different tools, but we would pick like a reference tool like Pyang as an example, and there would be a reference implementation there of presumably both algorithms that would come out of this work. But that is still an open question as to how far the work on this document will go.
Yeah, one last question: how do you report this? You may use these two different algorithms. You define some error code or error message. Do you need to distinguish it between this on-wire analysis and schema analysis? So
reporting is also an open question. Do you run with like a -- schema, a -- on wire? And get different output? Is that output JSON formatted so it can be loaded into another tool to be processed? Is it human text readable? Those are still open questions as to ultimately what we report, how we report, and what are the arguments that will generate the result of both algorithms, and at what verbosity level do we go? To some of what Jeff is saying or said, do we have all of these potentially non-backwards compatible in the output by default, or do we have just the things that we know we can test empirically and say these are non-backwards compatible? We'll get into a slide on those open questions. We need that help and that input.
Yeah, happy to contribute.
Join us.
Okay. Two comments. One as chair, one as contributor. As chair, please manage your queue as you see fit to be done in that time.
Copy that.
And then as contributor, what encodings are you looking at for on wire? Because different encodings may have different behavior as to what's compatible and non-compatible.
That is a good question. I don't recall us getting to the encoding question yet. And certainly we haven't, I don't think we broached anything around like binary encode, like a CBOR type yet. But those questions will have to come up. Unless, Rob, you can remember something I can't in terms of the conversations. I don't think we've gotten down to the encoding level yet in our discussions.
Robertson, Cisco, as contributor, I think for the encoding, it would come down to whether you end up embedding type information, like the type def name at all in the encoding, in which case that would change. Otherwise, I think that it shouldn't matter.
Well, the example that was shown is highly coding dependent, right? Because if you were in, let's say, a binary encoding, the type would change. While the example was text encoding with XML, and it didn't change.
What was the example? Was it
the counter, the UNT 8?
Oh, if it changes to a different size.
Actually, this one may not have, but I'm sure we can come up with an example where it does.
If there's ones where it has like you move from a uint8 to a uint32
Yeah.
and that is embedded in fixed size, then yes, I agree.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think you'd flag, I think in all these cases, you flag them up when you're doing the comparison. So we figure out what's changed and then you make a decision as to whether it matters to you or not and whether you classify it as NBC or not. So
Yeah, I just think it's going to be, it feels like a slippery slope here of whether or not it's a good path to follow, quite honestly. But we'll see where the work progresses.
Okay.
Thanks for the comment.
Jason.
Hi, Jason Stern here. Yeah, I agree with the comments about the encoding. We'll have to consider that, especially even encodings that aren't necessarily IETF, like gRPC-based encodings. The thing that I wanted to mention is I find a useful way of thinking about it, although the other people and authors may be thinking about it differently, is I think of the schema analysis as applying the full rules for module versioning. So everything that is in there that defines an NBC change would be flagged as an NBC change by the schema algorithm. The other algorithm, the on-wire, that's the one where the more debate's going to come in, and it's, is there a subset of rules? Are there some rules we can ignore that clients don't care about for on the wire, and will some operators and users of the modules who maybe aren't augmenting, who aren't composing them, who are just purely kind of using them as from a client point of view, maybe they don't care that a type def was renamed as long as all the properties stayed identical. They don't care the type def was renamed. But in our schema algorithm, that's NBC change. We didn't change that rule from 7950. So this is really what we're struggling with mainly is there an on-wire algorithm that makes sense where we chop out a number of rules and that's a useful comparison as output?
Carsten?
Carsten Wohrmann. The biggest trap we have in Yang CBOR is that when you put something into a union, the encoding has to change because Yang has built-in ambiguity for overlapping types in unions. And given that these types may have different encodings in Yang CBOR, we essentially have to switch to a completely different encoding once a union is involved. And that's always non-backwards compatible change.
Thanks. Yeah, as Jason said, we will have to discuss that. My clock's running, so let's head on to the next slide.
So you're cutting the queue. I
Yes.
appreciate that. Thanks.
11. Okay, so compatibility of error messages. This is something that that started to be discussed later, more recently. If we look at some of those error messages, clients may rely on those error messages. It's kind of a weird way maybe to do programming, but they might look at the string and say, oh, this string has changed. So that's something we might want to float up, is if you're dependent on this as a client, that's that part of that on-wire nebulousness that Jason alluded to. We might want to flag that up. With failed must statements, we can assume that changes there maybe are NBC. And again, with all of this, we might flag this up as being potentially non-backwards compatible just because clients may depend on it. Next slide, please. So what is the scope? I mentioned, do we do schema, the entire schema versus module? Do we consider run it from a feature lens standpoint, or we just look at everything as kind of a flattened, assume all features? And do we look at, are we looking at submodules, or how do we look at submodules, imported modules versus implemented? And do we offer the ability to filter out? How complex does the tooling allow us to be? Final slide, I think, well, there's this 14. So here are some of the open issues. I'm not going to read them all. You can look at them, but some of this Chen mentioned, and I mentioned that we would get to this. What are we going to do here? How much are we going to do in terms of code publication? This could turn into hackathon work as we get more crystallized in the document. Next slide, please. And yes, thank you. So I did answer a number of questions. I am out of time, but we are meeting weekly on Tuesdays. We will meet on April 4th. It's at 10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. I'm not going to do the math. So we would appreciate anyone joining that. It's open to all, and Jason does a good job summarizing on the list. So thank you very much.
Thanks. There were some interesting comments in the chat. They weren't substantially different than what was voiced, but it's still interesting. You might want to take a look at that.
Copy that.
And this seems like a good topic for further discussion on the list, in addition to in that side meeting.
Yep. Thank you.
And next up, Shufang.
Hello everyone, good morning. And this is Qiu Fang from Huawei. And this presentation is about the system-defined configuration. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I think this work is already adopted by working group a couple months ago. And there was a vigorous discussion, and the authors would really appreciate that. And since the last IETF meeting, there were some updates, but I think most are editorial updates for clarity. And the solution now, I think, is generally stable. So I think we already agree that we can define a config true read-only system data store to hold system configuration, and we define a resolve system parameter which controls whether to allow the server to perform the autocopy of the reference system configuration into running automatically. And the reason I said it is generally is because I think there are still a lot of details that need further discussion. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this slide tries to capture the ongoing. Oh, sorry. So this slide's about this one of the update of the document about the server behavior if not given resolve system parameter. So generally, we think that we would always want the client to have control over the configuration or completely own the configuration, and the servers making changes to the configuration without the client knowing that could be really surprising and sometimes even cause some confusion. So instead of simply say that the server should not modify running in any way, otherwise not specified by the client, the new version of the document just did not use the capitalized should not and said that clarify that the intention is to bring awareness to the general need to not surprise clients with unexpected changes. Okay, next slide, please. So this slide is about the ongoing discussion around the system configuration and key store trust store drafts, I think led by Kent in NetConf working group. The discussion is happened on this week, so I try to capture some of this discussion. And I think it's Rob raised a question in his AD review about whether we are making this more complex than necessary to always require all the reference system configuration must be present in running. And I think it's a reality that the NMDA and Young Van both define that running must always be valid. That's the reality, right? But I can also understand that the MDA drafts also said that it is intended that is subject to the validation. So if we say that the reference system configuration is not in running, I think we can definitely think it's okay to consume that running is implicit valid if intended is valid. But I do think that there is a quotation from Eugen on mailing list. I think Ian raised the very similar comments about this. What happens between running and intended is not covered by any standards as of today. So there could be the configuration transformation from running to intended, but this is how that transformation happens in not standards today. So I do worry that this might be difficult for the clients to enforce offline validation of running because they have to implement the vendor-specific configuration transformation algorithm or we can just say that maybe the client can use that result system parameter to allow the server merge the reference system configuration into running, but that would really hurt the legacy client. A legacy client, they do not know the result system config parameter and also do not know the existence of system would be might break unless all the reference system configuration is copied into running. So, but on the other side, if we require that the reference system configuration must be in running, and we need to answer the question what happens if configuration in system updates or disappears and a stale copy is still in running. That's a question we need to clearly stated in the document. But I think generally we never want the something like automatically sync up into running about the system update. So this about my consideration. Is there any comments regarding this slide?
Rob Wilton, Cisco, I think as a participant, a contributor. So my concern here is about, it's the same sort of thing that's happening on the thread. Basically, I think we need to have more discussion on the alias and resolve this, because I think it's a key thing. And it's almost like an ambiguity that was in RFC 8342. When we defined it, we defined how you could evolve the configuration between running and intended by doing template expansion and commenting out configuration. But we still kept the statement that running is always a valid data store. And I think there's been different interpretations as to what valid means in that context. And some people interpret it as being valid by implication, because you go and you update intended at the same time, you validate intended, and by implication that makes running invalid. So it makes running valid. And then other people are also interpreting it as saying, well, no, it means that it's valid as per RFC 7950, which I think is what it states, and hence you need to check all the leaf refs and things like that, because I don't understand how, if you have like configuration that you might be able to comment out, that you have to both validate the configuration in running with the configuration not commented out, and you also have to be able to validate it intended with the configuration commented out. So I think you end up in an inconsistent state. So I think this is something we need to think about carefully and make sure we end up with a sensible answer.
Okay, thank you. So next slide, please.
No, Kent, I have a poll ready for this discussion.
So Kent is asking you to do a poll here. Kent, do you want to introduce it?
Oh, sure. So it's just what Rob was saying at the moment, a moment ago. Would it be okay to move for this draft, to move to NMDA's interpretation now? That is, that running is valid vis-a-vis intended being valid.
Before you poll on this, can I, Rob Wilson again, can I just make one quick comment? Is there is a solution here potentially where we define different semantics for NMDA compatible servers and pre-NMDA ones. So we do have that choice as well.
We're not getting a lot of uptake, and it may be that people feel like, personally I do as contributors, I want more discussion before chiming in on this. I'm not ready to like vote, and I know we don't vote, but I'm not ready to have a firm opinion. I need more discussion. So I'm going to interpret that the low participant count is for that. I don't know if that's helpful or not.
Yep. I think that's good for now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next
Thanks,
slide. Yeah. This discussion is about the result system parameter, because currently we define this parameter to allow the server to copy the reference system configuration into the target text store. And I think we need to think about that, what's the precise meaning of the reference, because generally maybe most of our understanding is about the the leaf reference, the system configuration present in a leaf reference path statement, but I don't know whether we should also cover the cases like the system configuration is in a when or master statement or defined as the mandatory true data node, which is not configured by the client when pushing an edit config into running, or just the system configuration is defined to exactly satisfy the mean element constraints. So I don't know whether the resolve system should cover these cases and also put all of these into the running. Next slide, please. And this slide is about the timing for the server to enforce autocopy. Currently, we just think that the enforcement should at the end of the RPC operations, but I do want to know if this is actually correct. I think if the target data store is candidate and the test option is set, maybe we can just defer that autocopy to a commit of a that RPC, but in this way, I think we can argue the commit of a that to support this parameter. But if we would like to cover when statement, I think when conditions present in the XPath expression should always be copied during the edit config, because that is during the payload person as defined in 7950. Okay. Rob, please. Yeah.
Rob Wilton, Cisco, again as a participant. Can you go back to the previous slide? I had a comment on that one. So here, my intuition would say that if the data store validates and intended with the system configuration merged in, then what you'd copy into running is everything you needed to merge in to make it validate into running. So effectively, you're copying anything extra was added in that made the validation succeed, is what my instinct was to answer that.
Exactly. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. Okay. Is there any other comments or questions?
Yeah, hi, Charles Eckel. And just a question on this, because the liaison that I mentioned earlier, it talks about two things, the is invariant and then also system config. And that prompted me to take a quick, look at both drafts. And there's obviously a lot of similarity in the requirements there. I was just curious, what are your thoughts? Does this also address, or could it with minor modifications address the is invariant requirement of 3GPP? Or do we really need two different mechanisms here? Any thoughts on that?
So I think this document states the system configuration management mechanism, and it's not really about the intention to module the is invariant, but we do have another immutable flag document to resolve that issue, and we also think it's important to module the system configuration to show the client that they cannot modify this system configuration, should be read-only. But some folks also think that there could be other cases, not only just this configuration. So that's the reason why we would put another individual document and decouple with this document.
Okay. Yeah, just like I said, with a quick look at both, there's a lot of overlap, it seems to me, between the two. And it'd be nice to have one mechanism that meets both use cases, if possible.
Okay, thank you. So Blash.
2 points. If the autocopy is deferred to commit on a candidate, but you also need to configure some items that are below contained in the autocopied parts, that would mean that you can't do it in one go. You have to make it two separate commits. So I don't think auto commit can be deferred for this reason. The other is the answer to the previous question is that some people want to use immutable or some similar solution even without the system config. So
Yeah,
that's one more reason to
exactly.
separate.
Yeah, I will answer your question on the mailing list because I have no time for this presentation.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it. Charles, you're still in queue. I don't know if you mean to be, but we're gonna move on if that's okay. Just so we stay on time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I believe Kathleen is next up. Kathleen, are you here? Yes. Awesome.
Yes.
Welcome.
Thank
The floor
you.
is
Thank you
yours.
for having me. Can you hear me okay?
You
I hear
sound
you
great.
fine, and I pass control to you.
Oh, okay. I only have 2 slides, so this is pretty simple. The IETF Trust got an inquiry from the IEEE because they would like to use the Yang Security Considerations template that has been long in use by the IETF, edited over time, but I think the last edit's been several years. I want to say it was 2018 was the last time there was an edit to it. And essentially it's template text. We keep it in a wiki. And then, as you know, when you're writing a Yang document, you copy this into your security consideration section. You edit the parts marked to be edited, and you're done. So other organizations would like to use this, but they wanted to do it properly, so they reached out to the trust to see how to do that. We dug into it, and it looks like we didn't do the right thing by just setting up the wiki. The trust legal provisions, and I have a link here, but you could just quickly search trust legal provisions, and it'll come right up. Item number 9 explains that if you have template text in a document, that you can copy it and use it in the way that we do the wiki, but other organizations could use it similarly. And this is ideal, right? Because then everybody's using the same set of security considerations. It's nice that they're just following ours. It makes it easier for vendors to have that consistency across SDOs. So essentially, this just pulls the exact text. It doesn't modify it at all, because that would be a different process, and puts it into a document on its own so that you're only using this document for template text, and then SDOs can consistently use the same one. Are there any questions? So myself and the trustees would like to get this through fairly quickly so that there is a stable RFC for the IEEE to reference for one of their publications in Q.
Hi there, Glendine. Appearing in my role as chair of the IETF Trust, I think this may in fact be the very first time that a trust issue has come to a technical working group to be presented, so it's kind of cool. What Kathleen said, IEEE is trying to publish this. We found a mistake in the way it was labeled. Nothing else has really changed here. And we're trying to find a pathway to let them make use of this in the way that it was intended to, but do it in a way that fits in with the IETF's rules for how stuff is licensed and accessed. So it's a pretty minor change, and it would really help get this thing usable by IEEE in the way they want to use it, which is what we intend to in the design of the whole thing. So we'd like to get your support for doing this.
So Rob Wilton, Cisco, I think with an AD hat on. So when Kent was doing his drafts in NetConf to do with the key store and all those related ones, there was some discussion from Kent about what the right way for populating this template was in terms of what paths do you actually want to identify here? Do you identify all of them, which the template sort of leads towards describing today, or should you really be just picking out the key ones that have particular security implications, ones that you might put NACAM rules on? And I'm somewhat persuaded by Kent's comments that actually I wonder whether we're putting too much stuff in this section, and we should be trying to cut it down and refine it to something where you're only putting out the sort of more detailed things. So before I heard about this sort of thing, I was chatting with the security ADs in the ISG about saying I was potentially wanting to rework this template text and to change its definition potentially. However, this came in, and I understand that this is quite pressing to sort of sort out and resolve and get this get this document sort of in and through the process. And hence what I would like to propose is we get this through the process quickly to keep our liaison relationship happy with IEEE that wants to use this and solve that. But actually we then reopen whether the text is the right template text and have a discussion as to whether we want to refine that. But that would then follow up as like a BIS update of this fairly quickly.
I'm sorry, a BIS update of what?
Well, the BIS update of whatever this one turns into, this RFC.
This isn't an RFC, this is a wiki.
Right,
I
he's saying
think
he would AD sponsor it, and then the next revision after AD sponsorship becomes an RFC, he'd like to open it up for revisions to the template separately.
I may
so
have
that the
missed it. Can you restate what you are asking for from this working group?
Kathleen, do you want to take this or do you want me to take this?
Yes, no, I can absolutely say so. Just as he stated with his hat on, we'd like to move this quickly as an AD sponsored draft, and then separately he raised an issue that they do want to modify the template text, but understands that this isn't the right forum. So for this draft, we'd like this to go AD sponsorship, move it forward, and then if there's edits to be done for that would be done in a BIS draft of the RFC once published.
So this is Lou with chair hat on. I think this is great. It's fine for us to be doing it in this working group, but I'll point out, but it's my memory that the wiki is an ops area wiki and not a NetMod wiki. So I would say that if you, from a process standpoint, I would have expected this to go to ops area, not to NetMod. Now that said, we should just move let's do what's expedient. If you want to move it here, I'm looking at Rob. If you want to move it here, it's your call. It's your area. So, but I would have expected you to bring this to ops area, not NetMod.
Okay. Benoit Claes. Hi, Kathleen. So if we need to solve that one, sure, let's do it. But let me ask a question. So it was done in a wiki because in the past we had to update it. And the process was very, very simple, meaning we discussed with the young doctors, we discussed with the security AD, the ops AD, and with the ISG, we just agreed to do it. Now you want to do us on a track. So what will be the process there? Right, let's say that we have got new security guidelines for, I don't know, CBOR or Young Push and all this. Do we need to get the buy-in from the entire community? Are we losing the flexibility to just do the what's right in terms of update? Now, I don't want to say we don't want to do this, right? You have a problem, let's solve this. But I want to think also about the process of updating this text in the future.
Thank you. And Benoit, it looks like it hadn't been updated since 2018. So it's been pretty stable. Although I guess the group is talking about new updates, so.
Glenn, you're at the head of the queue if you want.
Yeah, I just want to make one clarification. So part of the reason we're doing it through this path for the IEEE is so they can make use of it as a licensed material. Because the original request that came in was they wanted us to write them a specialized license for use of the wiki, which is something the trust doesn't do. So we're sort of, because it's an external org, had to go this path. Does that make sense? Okay.
So I remain a little confused on the specific ask from the trust. Can we, rather than do a draft, can we just put this text on the wiki and declare us done?
No, that was the problem.
Yeah, that's the problem. We can't license out the wiki. We want to license, the IEEE wants to actually do this following all the procedures. You're a former trustee, and we want to do all this right. We don't want to cut a specialized dedicated license to them for this one purpose. And so what we want to do is just do it under the existing framework that's established by the TLP, which says you publish an RFC, you wrap the text with these two tags, and you're good to go. External organizations can take that text, modify it as needed, and publish it. And so we're using the framework as it was intended, but it has to be via an RFC, not via a wiki.
So I like the expedited solution. It's great. I would suggest to the trust that they consider general licensing terms for the wiki so that the next person that comes along addresses that as well.
We'll take that under advisement, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So to wrap that up, I believe the action is with Rob to come up with a AD-sponsored draft and to tell us which working group he wants to run the process in, if he wants to run it at all in any working group.
Rob Wilton Cisco. So I think the draft is already there. Kathleen's already got a draft, so it's just a matter of how that goes forward. And I'm happy to AD sponsor this. I think that's fine, rather than put it through any working group, because it's the same text. There's no new text other than adding the begin end template text statements to it. So I think we just need to do this quickly. So I'll AD sponsor it directly.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for keeping us informed. And I see Michael is in queue, so let's let him and close out the session or this slot.
Thank you for such a concise slide, because I did not get this understanding from your document, and maybe that's a problem. So I have two questions. One is Glenn, can you tell us, really this was the only place we could do is an RFC? We don't have any other place we could put this there? That seems really surprising.
We looked, and I came up with the template text, and that was the one way forward.
Okay, so my next question, nothing to do with the, was it the IEEE or the thing is, does this new document constrain us to not keep our text on the wiki and update it as we go?
No, I don't.
Okay.
I don't think so, right, Glenn?
No. So, Michael, the specific reason we're doing it this way is because the external org, if you look at the trust provisions that Kathleen has linked on the slide here, they give a means for the IETF trust on behalf of the IETF to license out stuff to third-party organizations, and that's captured there. We don't today have a means to license out the wiki, but the wiki can be happily used within the IETF process. I realize that may sound weird and convoluted, but we're in the world of copyright, and it is weird and convoluted.
Fair enough. Let's do it as fast as possible then.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you for that. Definitely a little different. And moving on to the immutable draft. And you're stuck again.
Yeah, this
Excellent.
is too long again. Yeah. So the version should be this 06, which we submitted a couple of days ago. So next slide, please. And a brief recap of this document is that we think ideally any configuration is allowed to be created, updated, and deleted. But in the real world, there exists a lot of some data that cannot be modified by the client, but still needs to be declared as config true for all kinds of reasons, not just for system configuration, but for all kinds of other reasons, like we need to allow configuration of the design nodes, or place when must or leaf reference constraints, or just ensure some existence of specific immutable system created entries, while additional entries could be allowed to created, updated, and deleted. So we think that if the server already knows that it will always reject the configuration, it should inform the client early, possibly in implementation time, so that the client can avoid a failed operation like RPC errors. Next slide, please. So in the last IETF meeting, I think there are some folks do have some concerns regarding this work. Like it seems that we are adding some restrictions. We are making the life of the client even harder. But here the authors would like to highlight that immutability is an existing allowed behavior. Already today, the server is allowed to reject configuration for reasons not documented in the YARN module, because the server just internally consider that node as immutable, and this is not immutable. This is not documented in the YARN. There is no formal way to define that. This behavior is already allowed there, and it's not new behavior. It's not introduced by this work. And also note that there is a number of SDOs and vendors already implement this immutability concept. I will show you in next slide. So our goal here is we would like to define one standard IETF solution instead of the multiple existing vendor or organization-specific solution to facilitate the interoperability. Next slide, please. So this slide references the liaison sent from 3GPP about the users of immutability and Yang. There are a number of SDO and vendors to implement the either use the immutability concept already or just directly define this Yang extension in their specific solution. Next slide, please. And this slide is about the use cases of immutable configuration. They are very common and already documented in the draft. And so I'm not going to present them one by one because of the time limited. So next slide, please. And regarding the document updates since last IETF meeting, the authors try to reward the abstract and introduction sections to emphasize that the proposal tried to formally document the existing allowed behaviors. And we aim to create one single standard solutions. And also we emphasize that immutable behavior is allowed, but it should be discouraged and be treated as the last resort. And also we have some editorial and refactored updates regarding the solution part, but no substantial changes. This is not because the author thinks the solution now is completely perfect, but just would like to put more efforts on the motivation and use cases now. And we also add a temporary section in appendix about the usage of immutable concept among multiple vendors and organizations. And we also rewrite the use cases in appendix. We would like to travel the most common and most reasonable cases. Okay, next slide, please. So this slide is about an argument why current mechanisms are insufficient. Two mechanisms are mentioned in last IETF meeting. One is about NAC, which can be used to restrict the client access to a particular data node. But since immutability is something that server internally reject the configuration from the client, it will always reject that. But NAC can be disabled or can be bypassed. And last but not least, NAC rules to express the immutability itself is also immutable. It's read only to clients. There is no, it's useless to update them, and we have no way to protect them from being modified. It is much like a catch-22 issue. And regarding the Yang deviation, just Yang deviation is also a mechanism to help the client understand how the server implementation vary from the standards, but just cannot help modify the immutability of particular data node. It can only be used to deviate the current existing statement, like the mandatory config or min or max element, cannot help modify immutability. Next slide, please. And regarding the liaison sent from 3GPP recently, we think that the immutable document is an alternative which could be used to model the similar concepts defined used in 3GPP. One is about its invariant, and it's an attribute used by 3GPP. And when the is invariant is set to true, we think that this attribute is assigned a value when the object is created, but this value cannot be modified later. Then the only way to modify that is to delete it and then recreate with the desired value. And this could be easily documented be easily resolved in this in the solution we are proposed here with immutable and the create and delete exceptions. The exceptions for the create and delete, so you cannot update it. And the second concept is system created. It's used to express that the instance cannot be created or deleted by the client. So it can only be created and deleted by the server or the system, and could be used using the immutable Yang extension with the exceptions for update. So you can update, but you cannot create or delete it. Next slide, please. And for the next step, I think this document is derived from the system configuration work, and we have cooked for a long time actually for this work, and the authors like to, we can ask the working group to consider adopt this work. Okay, Jason in the queue. So Jason.
Before he goes, just a heads up, we are going to poll this. So if you have not registered on the mobile,
The microphone, please.
Jason,
Luke, can you
go right
speak into the microphone, please? We cannot hear you.
Yeah, sorry. Just a heads up. The poll, a poll is coming. Please, if you're in the room, register on so you can participate. Jason, go ahead.
Do you mind flipping to the previous slide for a moment? Jason Stern. So with the is invariant, I see what you're saying by in order to effectively change it, you'd have to delete and recreate the parent context, either the presence container or the list entry. And I guess in these transactional systems, usually you want the candidate to represent kind of to be a declarative of what state you're trying to get to. So I guess how I would kind of see this immutable in a way is all it's saying is the underlying server would have to destroy and recreate the object if you change the immutable value. In other words, you'd be able to, in the candidate, give that immutable leaf a different value, and the flag would just tell you that the server is going to destroy and recreate the parent in order to achieve that new configuration state. Is that what you mean?
I think it should be the client to delete it and then recreate, because I'm not sure if the client would experience some traffic disturbance if the server directly delete and then recreate that with the desired value. So it just cannot modify it, and we are documenting this behavior.
I'm going to start the poll because we're actually over time on this session and we're going to be running out of time. But so I'm going to start the poll and then we can continue with the queue. Kent and Balazs are up. So Kent.
The poll, because I can't unmute myself while the poll's running. So I think this is good work, and I just want to sort of answer Jason's question. I mean, Chiffon said it correctly, but I'll say it again. Nothing changes. There's no new runtime behavior being asked by the server. It's all the same runtime behavior. The only thing the server has to do is to ferry a document to the client. There's no new runtime behavior on the client either. If they don't want to look at the document, they don't have to. They don't have to request the document. But if they wish to have more knowledge about how the server behaves, then they can process the document. And so it's just goodness, I think, in that regard. Thank you.
All right. So on the actually, Balazs, go ahead. Maybe we found a new UI bug. Go ahead.
I agree with the previous said that we are not looking for new behavior. We are trying to document existing behavior. And some of these behaviors in 3GPP and I think also in ITUT are decades old. And they are not prepared to modify it because they have been using that for I don't know, 15 years the same way. They would like to use Yang and document all this in Yang. So we either serve them or tell them that you put that into proprietary solutions or description texts.
Okay, thank you for that. So this slot's over. We're out of time on it. We had somewhere under half of the room participate, an overwhelming number supported adoption. So we will be stay tuned on the list for this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Balazs? No, I'm sorry, Jeff. And if it's okay, we're going to give you 8 minutes.
That's fine. I'm hoping to recover some time for you. So I'm Jeff Haas. I'm here to talk about representing unknown Yang bits in operational state. Next slide, please. So we're in routing protocols and modeling routing protocols, bit vectors are a common element, and we have to figure out some way to represent the state that's in there. very easy example from the BGP Graceful Restart. We have a nibble that exactly one flag has been reserved for in the original RFC. And usually this is a common case. We have one, we have some, we have some that are reserved. Next slide. So the problem that we have is that in Yang, it's very easy to model known bits. We can do different things. Two most common patterns are to use identities on a base identity for that bit vector type. And we have an example of that inside of OSPF. We also have the bits type, which is a little bit nicer in terms of protocol niceness when you're trying to do debugging, because it actually gives you the explicit binding and naming of the things. Next slide, please. The problem that we actually have is, what do you do about the things you don't know about that aren't modeled at this point? And modeling known stuff is very easy. You name it, you give it a position. Even if it's an identity, you can just simply give that in the description. And the bits, it's part of the fundamental type. The trouble is, if you want to model the unknown stuff, well, you can't assign something and give it a name like unknown1 and then change the name. Yang wants these things to be stable. So the problem is, if we want to assign it to make it visible, this means that we cannot change it. So this is a problem. Next slide, please. So an example of, from the prior one, RFC 4724 started with, the R bit, and then we added the N bit in 8568. Next slide. So why do we care? And this means that incremental deployment of new features that made use of those unknown bits may cause the protocol element, that has a Yang model on the older version to see the new things, and they're not yet visible. Perhaps this is being passed transitively through the system and as a necessary thing for you to see for debugging something in the network. The troubleshooting is a big deal here. Next slide. So a modest proposal that I'm hoping the working group decides is boring and just quickly runs through the RFC process, if you agree, is we define a type def that gives a consistent naming scheme for unknown bits in a bit vector. And modules that need to operationally model those unknown bits create basically a parallel to the known bits of the unknown bits, which may be absent if there's none present in the protocol. And then you simply use this type in there to show those things. Next slide. So an example usage, if we call this thing the unknown bit types, we have unknown flags that go in parallel to the prior example. And this means that for those bits that were not actually known, going from version 1 where we only had the R bit to version 2 where we had the N bit, if this is a version 1 system that had only the R bit, the N bit would show up in the unknown flags in this example until we had a schema rev, in which case it would move into the expected place. This both gives the user an idea that the system is transitioned from we didn't know what to do with this to now we do, while at the same time not necessarily moving the bit positions. This means that tools that know there's association between these two leaves, which this is one of the things I suspect the working group will have an opinion about. How do you actually consistently say leaf known and leaf unknown are related to each other? Next slide, please. So this is hopefully a very modest proposal. I suspect the working group will have wisdom to share. This has had some feedback from the mailing list. My request is, if this is considered valuable work, the working group pick up adoption of it, and I suspect it probably can proceed to fairly rapid transit to the RFC editor queue if so.
Jason's in queue.
Turn. Hey Jeff, I guess one thought for you and maybe the working group is that this is kind of I guess a modeling convention being proposed. So I guess I'm kind of wondering, is this an informational RFC? Because we're not going to mandate that, this is the model that thou shalt use in IETF models for scenario XYZ. It's kind of like, hey, if you have a scenario like this, here's an idea of how you could model it. In fact, I could see many such proposals like this for various scenarios. It might be useful to have kind of modeling templates or modeling proposals. So I guess I'm just wondering how you see that as far as, is it informational you're thinking? Is there an applicability defined, or?
Yes, I understand your question perfectly. So what I would recommend personally is this document would go in as a proposed standard to define the type. That's all we're doing here is we're defining a type. It provides a example pattern of how it's useful. For the second half of your question of, do we want to mandate this? Absolutely not. No, the point is that people have freedom to use whatever modeling technique is best suited to their environment. This is just an available technique. Maybe the Yang doctors having this in their toolkit as part of helping people with reviews suggest this when appropriate. Alex?
Yeah, Alex, I'm Futureway. I didn't read your draft, but I have one question actually from your presentation, just a clarification question. So when you model this, how do you avoid basically this versioning issue that you said? So basically you had an old RFC, it had an undefined bit, you define it using basically your new type definition, then later on it becomes known, you still need to change that model. So can you explain how that works?
Absolutely, and in the face of the prior presentation about basically non-backwards compatible changes, the example, if we were to rev things forward, unlike what's actually in the BGP Yang model that inspired this, we have the version 1 with the known field, version 2 which just simply says this is unknown. If you're operationally receiving bit number 2, it shows up in the unknown case, not in the known ones. Version 2 of the draft of the RFC comes out, a bit vector gets defined, bit 2 is defined, so you do have a change in terms of schema presentation. Your bits for the known flags do alter. Your unknown bits change, or go completely away because there's nothing present in there. And this is expected because we're not changing the schema, we're not changing the semantic necessarily. We are providing, however, a hint to the user that this version of the model does understand this thing. It is not necessarily non-backward compatible, but it is an upgrade.
All right, okay, thanks.
All right, Balazs, and also I'm going to start a poll.
I think this actually modifies the backward compatibility rules. So going from this unknown to something known is backward compatible. So maybe still it needs to be documented in RFC. Thanks.
I agree the pattern is in that fashion. I tend to think of it personally as upgrade and maintainability, which will tie into the presentation that Mahesh will be giving. The working group will have an opinion about what this path looks like, especially in light of the non-backward compatibility and flagging these things as schema changes. I do not have a strong opinion about this detail. This is an operational fact of life. This shall happen, and the operational capability of viewing unknown state, we need to address this in some fashion, even if it's selectively per module. Thank you for your time.
Okay, we have a poll going on. Are you interested in this work or working on unknown bits, coming up with a convention? We're not adopting this document just yet. We just want to know if this is a topic the group would like to work on. Okay, so I'm going to stop the poll. It looks like about a little under half participated, or about half participated, and overwhelmingly there was, of those people, there's interest in this work. Thank you. And with that, I see Mahesh.
Anyway, I'll start. I guess I have a more abridged time. So this presentation was made by Jeff in the routing area working group yesterday. A focus, of course, being the work on BGP. And I'm going to tune this a little bit to the language aspect and the changes, the issues that we ran into. Next slide, please. So here's some of the core lessons that I'll kind of quickly go through. Next slide. So the model came out to be sort of 5 modules and 9 submodules. Yes, we did use submodules, although they're not very popular. But we liked it simply because it allowed us to bucketize items within the model that belong to certain modules. In total, it's close to 225 pages, probably one of the biggest Yang models IETF will have in quite some time. Normally, some of these Yang models would start off with a MIB, but we were blessed in a way that we got some initial work done by OpenConfig that we were able to inherit as a starting point. But that work of trying to define of what content needed to go into the model took us quite some time, even though what we were trying to do was only a core or a base model set of features that we wanted to define. And as usual, what happens, IDEA is a fairly active group. It has many more, drafts that go and become RFCs. This is 8 years and running. So you can imagine there was a bit of a feature creep that we had to deal with. And multiple reviews and iterations, we tried to see if this model was the right one. Yang doctors were kind of helpful, but they were not protocol experts, so definitely having those kind of eyes would have helped. And then, of course, the idea of having submodules and examination of where does a particular feature belong. Next slide. Feature statements were particularly a problem for us. Of course, as the group understands, they complicate the implementation in some sense. And in this particular case, we had features in a feature creep where some of those features, like add paths, are key elements for us in the model. And implementing them as under a feature statement, of course, would be a problem. So a decision had to be made in the sense of, do we add and keep add paths outside of the feature statement? The idea, of course, is that ultimately the augmentation of the model itself should be in a way that, the model had to be structured in a way that it could be augmented by new models. And we'll talk a little bit about what some of our experience was in dealing with that. Next slide. So here, as I said, one of the asks was, are we enabling future work? Are we in some way impacting some of the BES group drafts that needed to augment the BGP state, in particular like path attributes and address families? Did the base model allow for those augmentations? IDEA itself had some core features, as I said, in feature creep that we needed to add. Is that possible, not just in this model, but also in the future? And again, there are always incremental extensions with community types for things like route targets. Next slide. So with some of the work that we believe is extensible, we decided that the work, that the model had to be delegated to IANA, simply because of the need, or when we went through with the BFT model with the 2 lines of change, it took us a full year to just rev that RFC just to fix an error, or in some cases just to add an extension. So we decided to extend, make some of the models, IANA modules, for community types and formats, simply because I think it's easier to update and extend the model. As the working group knows, the choice of enums versus identities is kind of clear where you want to use them. As Jeff mentioned with the previous presentation, enums kind of force you to a particular a format, whereas identities give you the extensibility of defining them in augmentation models. We had particularly particular issues with extended communities. They usually are of string format, but need some kind of regular expression to qualify them, and which of course we'll see as in our subsequent slide cause some maintainability headaches for us. Next slide. What really helped us through the process in trying to make sure the changes were always working with examples and real world examples with ones that were complete, that touch multiple models or actually try to touch as many of the models is what you really need to make sure that your changes are sane at the end of the day. And as our build process was, it made sure that those examples were validated with every comment. Next slide. So in the interwork piece, which is probably some of the area of interest in this working group, we touched upon several modules that we work with. Keychain to manage securing the BGP session, routing, it forms the basis of the core framework for the model. TCP, the transport, BFT for liveliness check, network instance, and one thing that I forgot to mention is schema mount. Testing integration with all these models found us bugs in BGP and also the corresponding models, particularly BFT, TCP, and policy. And those we were able to address because they were not RFCs. IPsec was a different question. It had already been shipped as an RFC. Does this work is what has always been problematic, and that's the reason why we bring this presentation here, trying to draw attention. It's important. What would help is a package of modules that we have been tested together and verified that they work. I'll quickly run through. I think I only have 2 more slides. We can skip this. In conclusion, would have doing this work in a shorter time frame helped? Absolutely. But even just getting the initial content into the model was hard. And once you have done it, and almost every subsequent review kind of asked us to glaze. It was harder to find things that were missing. In short, we found that interwork not only was important, but it needed to be tested to make sure it was working. Just a quick shout out to Martin and Mikhail for their support on the tooling side.
Yeah, I really appreciate this. I think it's important for the group to hear it. Unfortunately, we do not have time to discuss it, which I think many of us would be very interested in doing. So please take your questions to the list. Thank you very much. And we're going to move to the next. Incident management. Chong? And also, you're going to have 8 minutes.
Hello, everyone. I'm Chong Feng from Huawei. Let me introduce the incident management on the network service. Next, please. The motivation. The further motivation is with the growth of new service and service complexity. A lot of information, including alarm, KPIs, and traffic information, are reported to manage in the system. It causes heavy workload, and this information needs to be further analyzed by network maintenance engineers. It may result in inaccurate root cause identification, and several alarms may be associated with one fault, so it may produce some duplicate tickets. Second, performance data, alarm data, transformation are managed separately in our current system. However, we found some faults also depend on some other type data. So it's very difficult to access the impact of alarms and metrics on network service. Next, please. To address these changes, we propose a new solution called incident management. Incident is the unexpected interruption of network service, degradation of network service quality, or sub-health of network service. This concept is aligned with TMF. Incident management provide several functions. First, different type of data sources are managed in a unified manner, and this data can be aggregated into an incident for the network service. The second, identify the relationship between the incident and network service, and the relationship can be configured as defined in service assurance architecture. Of course, the relationship can also be dynamic. The third will provide some standard APIs to manage the life cycle of the incident, such as incident report, querying, diagnosis, and resolution. Next. There are 4 use cases for incident management. UC1 and UC2 are all pre-configured example. You can see several alarms or metrics can be aggregated into an incident and get the affected network services by the pre-configured policy. And UC3 is about the dynamic relationship. AI can be used to use for root cause identification and service impact analysis. UC4 is about the exploration of the incident. In some scenarios, such as cutover or energy saving, a lot of alarms will be triggered from these devices. But actually, this alarm is not useful. So some labels can be placed with these devices, and if the incident management detect the alarms are associated with these labels, these alarms will be ignored, and thus the incident will not be triggered. Next. Let me clarify the relationship between incident and alarm performance. You can see in the left figure, performance and alarms are triggered by report to domain controller, and in domain controller, this information will be aggregated into an incident, and the incident will report to the upper layer system like OSS. So they work at a different layer. Next. Next, please.
There's a couple people in the queue. Did you want to wait until the end to acknowledge the people in the queue?
Why don't we do them at the end if you can wrap up so that you can take questions?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
I will provide a data model for incident. Incident is identify the incident ID and associate it with one or more network service. and we also contain some critical members, just like domain, category, priority source, root cause events. Next, please. We provide an RPC called diagnose incident, can be used to find out root causes. Possible diagnosis method include link reachability detection, link quality detection, alarm or log analysis, etc. Next. We provide another RPC called resolve intent. After the root cause is diagnosed, kind of man choose resolve the intent. They can use the invoke. They can resolve the intent by invoking other functions such as the routing configuration function, dispatching a ticket, or ask the agent to resolve it. That's all. Brother?
Balash?
So in the 3GPP, we had a very similar discussion between alarms and incidents. And it was discussed that alarms can be low-level alarms, like one interface is down, or they can be very high-level alarms, like half of the network is down. And it is possible to generate alarms based on 5 other alarms and 2 dozen counters. So just because it's on the higher level, we don't need a different mechanism instead of or beside alarms. If you can convince us that the information content between the proposed incidents and the alarms is very different, then yes, then we have to consider this. But just because there are more inputs to generate the incident or alarm, and because it reports on bigger items, not a single little failure, that doesn't mean it's a new category. Thank you.
Thank you.
Robert from Cisco. Just to say, I don't know if you're aware or familiar with the SANE architecture documents. They've gone through Ops AWG and in the RFC editor queue now, I think. It might be wrong, that's. But in terms of the slides, when looking at your slides, it looks very similar in terms of what you're proposing in terms of aggregating things up and generating results, and the sort of full lifecycle management again seems very similar to what the SANE architecture is proposing and encouraging. So my question is, how does this differ from what's already about to be published in RFC, and if it has different requirements, could it maybe be done as augmentations on top of that model rather than as an entirely separate model sitting alongside?
So this is Qianwu, and thanks, Balash, for the comments. Actually, the work actually we proposed, I try to align with TMF. Actually, we also have been aware of 3GPP and do this, have similar concept of the proposed like incident management. I think better to align all of these work. Also, I want to clarify this incident actually different from the traditional alarm. Actually, they more focus on, service level, and so this rightly actually complement with alarm management worker and try to provide more abstraction, reduce the overload on the high level upper layer management system. So yeah, thank you.
Benoit Claes. So for me, the biggest advantage of this work, this is actually because it tried to map 2 different worlds in the world of autonomous networking. The one from TMF, which is top down, and the one from the IETF, which is bottom up. And we know that if we want to solve autonomous networking for the industry, we have to do that. This is one of the first attempts of doing this matching. I knew I had to do that for some time. I always push it. So thank you for this work.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to move on to Michael.
Can you pass me the slide control by clicking on my name to the right? Thank you. Okay, so this is a bit of implementation report, if you like, and I'll be very quick. I talked about it in Anima before a couple days ago, but I really would like your feedback, or at least, your awareness of what was happening. We have this document, RFC 8366, which Kent is a co-author, and created this thing called a voucher, and it was great. We augmented it in 8995 to create this voucher request. And then a little while later, we created this constrained voucher, and we did it again, probably wrong, as an augment. And we then did a whole bunch of SID stuff, and I think we were the first users to do anything with SID. And that's another discussion. So another group came along and said we'd like to make some additional changes. We have this Brewski in PRM mode, and they needed some other fields in the vouchers and the voucher requests, and they did it with augment. And we thought that was great at the time. And then we asked the question, well, what if we wanted to mix them? Like, would that work? And the answer is mostly no, it does not, because augment actually essentially creates a copy of what you had before, lets you refine it, but it gives it a new name. And when you try and mix the green and the blue into the new lighter green, you get 2 copies of pink. And initially it looked like it wasn't a problem because there were bugs in Pyang and it just happily overwrote one with the other. And we then discovered while we're allocating SID numbers that in fact there was a real big problem. And in fact, it revealed the whole problem. So I've tried to document this through a series of experiments last summer. And I would love to have more feedback on if there's something stupid that I did there. And that's in some of the mailing lists. So what did we do? We stepped back and said, hang on, first of all, Yang data is, no longer cool. Let's do it with SX structure and see what happens. And maybe we should be doing it such that we actually create a bunch of little bits of cookie and we put them together. So imagine we did this we created a pink and a red and a green and a blue part. And we first start off by mixing some of them together that way. And then the obvious next step is you put this PRM voucher request, some green, and then we put the blue one in instead. That's really, really great. And then we say, okay, we're going to mix them together. Let's put them all together. Okay, how does that work? Well, it's okay if we were starting from scratch. We had 3 problems, really. The first is that it's not compatible with the original RFC 8366 voucher. I don't have proof of this. Yang Lin doesn't seem to even want to run the examples from that anymore. And I don't really know how to make that all work, but I'd still like to validate this doesn't work. But specifically, we wind up with a different structure and it appears to serialize out into JSON in a different format, and that would make it a completely different thing. The other thing that we got is that it became obvious that actually we've created new objects. We haven't done what we wanted, which was to extend the objects in much the way that, most protocols or other things would do that, where they would, have an IANA registry or something like this and do that. So that did not work out. And actually every one of these things winds up with their own SID file if you do it correctly. And that's exactly what we did not want, which was new set of objects and new set of numbers. So what do? We removed all the Yang from their documents and we wrapped it up into RFC 8366 BIS as a single Yang module. And I think based on what I observed going through other working groups, it's essentially what everyone does is they put their Yang in one file in one document, all their logic in another document, and they just plan on revising the Yang module whenever necessary. And so that's essentially what we've done. If we were to start over again, I think we would do all the CDDL rather than Yang. And so that's maybe the feedback you don't want to hear. And I would love to hear on the mailing list, probably not here, was there something else that we missed that we should have done instead? You're allowed to go back and tell us we were stupid back in 2017, and that's okay. Or was this inevitably what's going to happen when you use Yang data at rest or structure? Thanks. Oh, he's not coming to the mic.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
I think you've stunned us into silence. So the group seems to have lost energy on this, but
Yeah.
Appreciate the feedback. And
so there is an example. There is an example repo where I put all these 3 methods that we tried together into a simplest version. And if you want that, I should have put that in my slide, but I didn't because I thought it was dead. But it's on the mailing list several times.
Well, if you can bump it to the top by sending it to the list again, that would be
I'll
really
do that.
appreciated.
Have a good day.
So
Enjoy lunch.
I appreciate that. So we've reached the end of our session. and almost the end of the meeting, but so appreciate all of you who've stayed to the end, and look forward to seeing you at in the next meeting, maybe even in person. And really appreciate all those who were here at odd times to participate remotely. Thank you all. Kent, do you want to say anything?
Yes, sorry, it takes a little bit for the mic to turn on. On Michael's last presentation, there wasn't anyone that came. I think we were stunned to silence, but maybe we could poll for interest in an interim. Or people want to talk about this after?
Sure, if you want to do a poll.
Okay, I'll try to do one fast.
While you're doing it, I'm going to ask for a show of hands from those in the, oh, here we go. Here's the, so if you're interested in talking more about the issues that Michael raised, please raise your hand. From my standpoint, even though it's not a lot of people saying yes, I think that's sufficient to warrant having more discussion on the topic. So good call on that. I think there's also interest in perhaps learning more about BGP experiences. So stay tuned for a couple of interims in addition to the adoption call we talked about earlier. Thank you all so much. And with that, we're closed.